welcome to the last panel session for the conference, which is on political economy and electoral dynamics. We'll have four papers being presented. Just a reminder, so we'll have 15 minutes for the presenter, followed by 5 minutes for the discussant to discuss the paper, and then 10 minutes for Q&A, and we'll go sequentially for each paper. We'll start off with Cory Smith's paper on whether basic democracy is enough. Cory?
All right. Thanks so much to the organizers for including me. Thanks to the audience for staying to the bitter end. I hope to make it worth your while. So I don't think I have to motivate the importance of democracy and elections too much for this crowd. It's something, a topic we all know and love. And there's been really good evidence in the last few years that transitioning a country from an undemocratic system to a democratic one can have a number of benefits in terms of public goods provision and economic growth. But if you look around the world, there's really a lot of countries whose systems don't neatly fall into the categories of democratic or undemocratic. These variously might be called hybrid regimes or flawed democracies. And these are cases where elections play an important role in the political system, but they're not the whole story. Certainly back home in the United States, this is something I see a lot of people worrying about for our country. And that's especially because it's unclear if that type of basic level of democracy should have the same benefits as the larger scale transitions do. It's unclear if we should apply the lessons of complete transitions to partial ones or to gray area cases. And that's the jumping off point for the motivation today. Another way of framing this is to say we should learn more about the impacts of democracy on the margin. And I think coming in, you could have a number of different ideas about what type of effect that should have. Most positively, we could imagine that elections and democracy always produce good effects. It helps us select the right people to be in politics, and it gives them the incentives to work for their constituents. But it could also be that in these types of systems, the elected officials aren't given a lot of power, or don't really call the shots, and so the elections are symbolic. Nothing much changes. Maybe most pessimistically, you could also imagine that the elected officials aren't really able to perform particularly well in these systems with some authoritarian content, and the gridlock or conflict that causes actually leads to some type of negative impacts. So that's all very interesting and fun speculation, but how could we actually get any data on this type of question? First, what is a marginal change in the use of democracy? What seems marginal to you might actually seem like a big deal to me. Second, even if we could agree, most changes within and across political systems aren't random and are packaged together in a very big institutional bundle that's tough to disentangle. So that's where this paper and this project are going to come in. I'm going to be studying local government in Pakistan in the 1960s, and this setting has two key features that are helpful in this context. First, local councillors of this era could get their seats either by winning an election or by being selected by the military government of the time. And the ratio of those two is not constant and allows me to sensibly discuss what is a marginal change in terms of power to elected versus unelected officials. Second, unlike most other systems like this, the number of seats of each type was determined by a formula, and I'm going to exploit quirks in that formula to get essentially random variation in the extent to which elections versus non-electoral means are used to select politicians. And I'm going to look at what impact that has on the provision of public goods and longer-run economic development. I'll get into the details soon, but you should imagine this is an alternating or even odd style source of variation. All right, so very, very briefly on contributions. These types of mixed elected, unelected bodies are pretty common globally. I picked the case of Hong Kong here because it's been in the news since the fraction of Hong Kong's legislature that's elected has been steadily shrinking since the 1990s. But we can think of many, many other cases as well. Historically, lots of parliaments in places like the UK or Iceland were not fully elected and were partially appointed. There's not too many studies within economics of these types of systems, so that's one aimed for contribution of the paper, is to provide some evidence on these. But more broadly, I also hope you come away thinking about bigger themes in other settings of the relationship between democracy, public services, and economic growth, and how this relates to the quality of democracy and how to measure it. And my pitch to you is that, actually a lot of political change can happen on the margin, and we should understand its impacts. What I can offer there is a very large-scale apples-to-apples comparison across many different political bodies that differ really only in their fraction of elected versus unelected seats. And finally, if nothing else, this setting was rolled out, the system was rolled out nationally to a country we all know and love. So, it's important to study in its own right. All right, very brief outline of the talk. I'm going to say a little bit about the background of these councils, how that leads to a natural experiment. And then we'll get to, I really just have time for one main result, which, to be honest, was a little bit deflating, at least for me. In this context, a marginal increase in elected's political influence actually decreases the provision of public goods and long-run economic growth by something like 3 to 5% of a standard deviation in an aggregate index. That's not huge, but especially given the duration, that's not trivial either. I'll very briefly discuss mechanisms and, essentially try and convince you that what's happening is a lower level of activity from the council itself and not, say, favoritism from a higher level of government. This is consistent with qualitative evidence on a high rate of conflicts or gridlock within these councils, and I think that is one plausible explanation for the effects we see here. Okay, so very briefly on the background. This paper is going to be studying the system known as basic democracies in Pakistan, hence the title of the paper. This is due to General Ayub Khan, who most people probably know, takes power and forms a military government in Pakistan in 1958. But he's still actually eager to present himself, at least publicly, as a pro-democracy figure. So in 1959, he designs this system of basic democracies, creating really the first iteration of the union councils in Pakistan. There's about 4,000 of these, and I'm mostly going to focus today on their role as local governments, where their powers are pretty standard. They can raise some taxes and spend primarily on local public goods. So think of something like a village school. They're pretty influential in this era. Ayub Khan tends to want to put resources into the hands of rural areas, and the union councils of this era are the mechanism through which he does so. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns in the story of local government in Pakistan, which we definitely don't have time for. Just to say, the details I'm going to give focus on the first round of these councils, essentially 1960 to 65. There's 2 5-year terms under basic democracies before the system is overhauled after Ayub Khan's tenure. Okay, a little bit about the structure of these councils. There's a wide range of sizes, anywhere from 10 to 25 councillors is common. And as I mentioned, to become a councillor, you either had to win an election or you could be appointed by Khan's administration. And the ratio of those two groups can serve as a very basic measure for electoral representation, or, if you will, the extent of democracy in the council. Now, I promised you a formula. Here it is. Essentially, what we do is we calculate the population of the Union Council, and that determines the number of elected seats, 1 per 800 people. And more crucially, what happens is to get the number, to get the number of appointed seats, we take the number of elected seats, divide by 2, and round down. So if we have 4 or 5 electeds, we get 2 appointed. If we have 6 or 7 electeds, we get 3 appointed, etc. And if you squint at those numbers a lot, like I have, what you'll see is that if you fall into a population bin that gives you an odd number of elected seats, you'll have a little bit more elections to non-elected seats. It's a bit easier to visualize this. So this is the ratio of the elected to unelected seats. Electeds are always at least a 2-to-1 majority, but the odd-numbered places actually have about 11% more elected seats to unelected. And it bounces up and down in this highly nonlinear pattern. And so that sort of, helps me build my argument to say that, no other omitted variable should match this very strange artificial pattern. And therefore, this odd-even difference is a good source of variation for understanding the impact of increasing the number of elected seats. Very briefly, here's the distribution of the council sizes. You might worry that there's sort of manipulation. Maybe the bureaucrats who designed this preferred odd or even ones, but just eyeballing it, it seems like a pretty smooth distribution. All right, very briefly on data. I'm going to pair data and link data on the council structure to the Moza census in Pakistan throughout essentially most of its independent history. And that's going to give me data at the village level on things like the local public goods and also some other public goods provided by the central government. All right, we have time for one, sort of balance or placebo check. These are the local public goods that the councils are plausibly in charge of, but prior to the council's creation, these are from the 1951 census. And what you'll see is that even in odd places look very, very comparable, sort of tight zeros, nothing statistically significant, and that's true both on each individual metric and if they're combined together into an index. And that's going to bring us to our main result, which is that going forward, councils that had more elections, or the odd-numbered ones, ended up reducing their provision of public goods in the following years. So, the main outcomes are going to come from 1972. We can think of that as a 5 to 10 year effect, and you can see that there's really negatives all across the board. Just to put this into context, this is about a 1.8% lower probability of getting a primary school. And that's true, for all of the different public goods I can look at. 4.4% loss in an aggregate index, 4.4% of a standard deviation loss. If you want some intuition about where identification is coming from, this is the public goods index residualized, and you can see that it matches this up-down pattern, except the councils with more elections actually are on the downswing rather than the upswing. I can also, run these same types of analyses really in any year. This is an economic index from the 2020 MOSA census, and actually it also shows a similar pattern, a loss of about 5% of a standard deviation. So, just kind of recapping all of this, the key thing is that a marginal increase in the use of elections actually seems to lower the provision of public goods, and that has negative implications for long-run economic growth. These effects aren't huge, but they're not trivial either, especially because they're very long-lasting. And what you can imagine is that affected councils are missing out on sort of the big push in rural development of the 60s without many mechanisms for catch-up. Thinking about why this is, that's going to bring us to the question of mechanisms. And what I'm going to try and convince you of here is that the councils themselves are really the primary drivers of this, not other levels of government. One way I can get at that is by looking at the set of taxes and fees that the union councils themselves use in order to raise money for their projects. These are publicly announced, and I've collected data on a number of them. And sort of collectively, there's a bunch of different, esoteric taxes that they can collect, but combined into an index, you see a loss of about 6% of a standard deviation, fairly similar to the other previous results. So that's important both because it says that the union councils directly have less money to spend on their projects, and because it suggests a lower level of activity in the council itself, just as a general feature. All right, and this also matches with a number of qualitative reports from contemporary observers that say that, conflicts or disagreements within the councils often created gridlock and were a major impediment for the councils spending the funds that were allocated to them, and therefore a major impediment to providing public goods. Now, another explanation that is also ex ante very plausible is to say that, maybe this is really more of a story of alignment or favoritism. Other levels of government are favoring, councils that had a higher fraction of appointed members. However, if you look at public goods that are provided by the central government, so these are things like a post office or a police station, you see basically no results across the board, small coefficients, fairly small standard errors, and that's true, again, individually and aggregated into an index. All right, so that's the main set of results I have time for today. Let me just sort of summarize by saying this paper has been concerned with the question of when do elections provide more for citizens, and at least the slightly deflating answer to me is that the answer is not always. Certainly in this context, I've looked at a natural experiment using this even-odd variation within the Union Councils of Pakistan to say that a marginal election actually lowers the provision of public goods with negative impacts on longer-term economic growth. I think largely this is consistent with theories that suggest that there's really non-monotonic effects from institutional change, and especially theories that really emphasize that democracy is not just the use of elections in isolation, but should probably be thought of as a tapestry of mutually self-supporting institutions and institutional features. So in other words, basic levels of democracy may not be enough for many of the outcomes that we'd like to see. I'm going to close it there just to say I hope this paper will be out, very publicly within a couple of months, and there I'll be able to do a lot more detail on many of these mechanisms and plenty of econometric robustness as well. But in closing, really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks again to the organizers for including me.
Thank you, Cory. If I can now ask Adeel Malik to offer his comments. Yeah, just should.
Okay, I really enjoyed this paper. I think it's an important inquiry. I like the particular threshold that you use, the idea for the marginal election by using this odd-even ratio. So my comments are really twofold comments. One is about framing, and the other one is about mechanism. So the story is that you have elections held under an authoritarian regime. I would think of it really as limited enfranchisement, right? And so what are the effects of this limited enfranchisement? If I were to write this paper, I would frame it in the larger political science and political economy literature on elections under authoritarianism. So some of the names that I was looking for in the paper and were absent were people like Lisa Blades, who did work on Egypt. You have Milind Swalik, Jennifer Gandhi. These are all people who explore why do authoritarian regimes hold elections, because they need legitimacy, they need some kind of a network of patronage they want to set up, right? And they want information. All those sorts of questions become important. So I'd frame this story more as part of elections under authoritarian regimes. The other thing is really about the mechanism or the explanation. What do we make of the results and how relevant they are for understanding elections under autocracies in the rest of the world? And for that, you have to take into account the local context a bit more deeply. My sense is that Ayub Khan was basically exploiting continuing pre-existing power structure. So in this part of the world, when the British opened the gates for electoral representation, they did it in a very selective way in the 1921 when they opened up enfranchisement. But again, much like Ayub Khan, it was a limited enfranchisement. There was a proportion of elected and appointed leaders. Appointed leaders were usually tribal chiefs, big zamindars, and then a category of elected people as well. So we would like to know more about history. How does history play into your story? Because he's really building on that historical inheritance. So we want to know who are appointed, who are elected. And there again, you need to understand that there was a major exercise in disqualifying different candidates at that time. So you need to study who were disqualified and who were appointed, who were elected. Just get a sense of that. And of course, if you look at some of the historical accounts, a lot of the elected and appointed leaders were again pre-existing elites. There were some major historic elites who couldn't play ball, so they were disqualified. But more or less, it kind of reinforced the British model of limited enfranchisement. So history is really important, the pre-existing power structure. And then finally, the role of bureaucracy is really central. So if you were to compare elections under Ayub Khan and elections under Ziaul Haq, the military held elections, but then the bureaucracy was given a front seat role, right? And the MPs were given, the MPs were given a front seat role because they were given development grants. So they could decide where to spend that money. Whereas under Ayub Khan, the bureaucracy was still very much in charge. They were making decisions about where to set up schools, roads, infrastructure. But politicians had veto power. So they could block, and you could find, if there are certain historical elites who were more entrenched, they might be using more power to block development in those regions. But it was certainly bureaucracy playing a key role. So the more you bring that contextual evidence, the better you would be able to refine your scope conditions. And obviously, this would have impact on how scalable, how widely applicable your paper is to the larger literature on elections under authoritarianism.
Thank you. We'll now open up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Sir.
Really excellent work. A couple of really minor questions. One is also related to what your discussant already said, like how free and fair were these elections? I mean, if we say that the person is coming into, through the democracy, are they really different from the other? That was the one question that I wanted to say. And two other things that I had to ask you was, if I take this theory of conflict between elected and unelected seriously, this might be a major problem, maybe where there are more counselors than when there are very few counselors, for example. So I wonder if you try to look at those uses where we have more counselors versus less counselors. And last smaller question is that how about the persistence of democracies in these constituencies, for example? Do we still see more elections, for example, often happening, and maybe the different candidates are coming from these sort of constituencies?
I wasn't sure, is this just one election or did you observe repeated elections?
Yeah, so just very quickly, this is the first round of these elections. I am going to look at re-election. That outcome is coming.
Because my question in my mind was that, even with this combination of elected and selected, if you have repeated elections, you may get different results. But maybe this has happened in other contexts. It'd be interesting to know.
Thank you. This was a great presentation. Since you have some information about the way the councils work, could you perhaps look at the sort of dynamics within the councils in these, especially in these odd numbered councils? So the appointed versus the elected. And is there perhaps a story building off of Adeel's comment where the appointed members are more likely to block when they're in minority? But in general, I don't know what the story might be, but in general, I think it would be really interesting to see what is the role that elected versus appointed members play.
I think I can take a second just to answer a couple of things.
Yeah.
Thank you first for your comments. It's always a good discussion when someone highlights the things you're planning to do next but haven't quite quite done it. And thank you also for the citations. I completely agree that we should understand this context as elections under authoritarianism. That's a very important thing to emphasize. Were these elections free and fair? I mean, it's very clear that they didn't meet that bar. A number of candidates were disqualified. The one thing I'd say, along with any other concerns you might have about captured democracy, the one thing I'd say is that, and this sort of gets to the heart of the paper, is to say there is a difference between saying the elections don't meet the free and fair bar versus they're purely symbolic or have no impact. And, just one takeaway from the paper, or that I hope to get across, is to say, even if the elections are only partially free or partially fair or are operating under strained conditions, that doesn't mean that they're purely symbolic. In terms of the who's selected and who's elected, that is sort of the data that's in process. So one interesting dynamic is to say you can the list of members is public, and that's sort of the last thing that I'm digitizing. It's going to turn out that on the measures I can observe, which are a little limited but still important, on the measures I can observe, appointed members tend to be higher or more frequently in elite status. But very interestingly, they're less likely individually to become the chair or the head of the council. So, I think at least on an individual basis, the elected members are pretty good at politics or, relative to their appointed members, but maybe not so good at the collective aspect of it. Certainly, there's a lot to do in terms of thinking about the connection to bureaucracy. My hope is to provide a bit more information about what happens to the politicians in terms of their careers, both in the short term and at least in the medium term. In terms of, there were just a few other small questions. So, what happens to the persistence of democracy? That I think is going to be a lot of work to get and might be the next project, but that's very much something I'm interested in. So I'm in the market for good data sources on how to look at that. Let me say, do we have time for more questions or how we?
I think we have a couple more minutes, 5 more minutes. Yeah. I
Okay,
think there was
all right.
a question.
Yeah, let me take a few more. I know I didn't get to every last thing, but
So yeah.
yeah.
Maybe we can have the lady first. And then sir over there.
So I think that's quite fascinating. The question I have is, I wonder if you looked at political clientelism, because that would actually explain this. It says it finds that when you have strong clientelist relationships, the politician doesn't engage with the masses. He just engages with your broker, and then the broker decides whether they will get public goods or not. So in sort of areas where clients have low bargaining power, the broker will not distribute goods, and you'll find that public goods provision is actually quite low. So I wonder if that is a possible explanation for what you're finding.
And then we also had a question on that side.
Yes. So you mentioned in the paper that councils with more elected members causally raised less revenue and provided less services as compared to councils with less elected representation. And you also want to mention that you feel that this could be because of internal issues within such councils. But don't you think that there might be sort of like a competence issue as well at that point, that if someone is being selected, they might have better competence and therefore that's why they're being selected? Or do you have sufficient evidence to feel that it is indeed due to internal rifts within councils with more elected representation?
I don't think there's any.
Okay.
Cory, go ahead.
Do we have? Okay, yeah. So these are both very great comments and are definitely things that are on my mind. In terms of brokers and clientelism, I think that's got to be part of the story. One question, though, is whether that would be more exacerbated under the elected versus the non-elected members. If anything, it seems like the non-elected members would be a bit more likely to have that. But that's one thing I'm still trying to get a good measure on. That said, the benefits could be limited due to the clientelism. In terms of competence, it's possible, especially if we think that elite status is sort of a proxy for some of the human capital that we'd like to see. There's another analysis in the paper, though, that tries to, based on the structure of the council and how the wards within the council are drawn, try and understand, if you sort of select more politicians from very educated areas, does that lead to any benefits? And there doesn't seem to be good evidence of that. So I don't think it's at least a very simple, human capital story, although I'll be the first to admit I don't have rich information on the competence of each member.
Sir?
Aspects from basic democracy, I feel the people's problem solved at lower levels instead of going to higher authorities. So this is one thing, one aspect. Second thing, when the President Ayub make this basic democracy system, the lawyers against this system, perhaps because they are own interest like that. What do you think about it?
No, I'd certainly love to read references on that, and I think that certainly is very plausible. One thing to emphasize from this paper is just that even in an authoritarian or military context, local and even local elected politicians do seem to have some impact on what happens in their constituencies, and I hope that's one very broad takeaway. And certainly, these types of elected politicians in authoritarian or military contexts, with all of the caveats that implies, that is a fairly common and widespread system around the world, and especially historically.
Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, folks.
Next, we have Adeel Malik, who will be talking about canals and the political economy of development, evidence from Punjab.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure, as always, to be back in LUMS and meet with all the old friends and learn a lot from these discussions. So this is joint work with my long-term co-author, Vincent Mirza at University of Kent and Zahra Jafri at UCL. The primary motivation for this paper is to really remind ourselves that a lot of historically, a lot of imperial administrations were fascinated with building water-related infrastructures. And you have lots of examples historically of that. There were the aqueducts in Rome, irrigation projects in ancient Egypt. Under the British, the Aswan Dam was built, which extended the frontier of irrigation. The Gazira irrigation scheme in Sudan, which in fact was built by many of the engineers who built the canal colonization process here. You have the Orange River project in South Africa, and I can go on and on. It's a phenomenon that has been very pervasive in history, a lot of these water infrastructure projects. People have looked at the impact of these water irrigation schemes on a variety of outcomes, on agricultural productivity, and thinking about how it shapes the broader vision of development. There's some recent work by Sam Asher on India, looking at the impact of canals on agricultural productivity. This paper really looks at its impact on inequality and the associated political economy. And in doing that, obviously, we build on a historic literature that talks about the impact of, these large-scale irrigation schemes on the very nature of the state and the types of inequality that takes root. In terms of our theoretical framework, we are inspired by recent work, in particular by Samuel Bowles. They have a very interesting recent paper in Journal of Economic Literature, where they talk about the origins of enduring inequality. And their story is very simple. They talk about the way in which societies move from labor-limited to land-limited systems. And that happens through the agency of the introduction of new irrigation technology or different types of agricultural technology. Historically, it could be ox-drawn plows and other types of technology. But in modern history, irrigation has been a key means through which that shift in technology takes place. And societies move more from labor to land-limited systems. And in land-limited systems, obviously, water rights are land rights, and the primary constraint to agriculture production is whether or not you've got irrigable land. And this has huge impact, persistent impact on the way in which inequality endures and sustained inequality takes root. And so in particular, they talk about the way in which this entrenches pre-existing elites, because there are a lot more opportunities for wealth accumulation as well as for preserving that wealth. What we are going to do in this paper is to really leverage this large natural experiment, which I don't need to set out the context in detail because most people in this room would be aware of this large irrigation scheme in Punjab and the associated political economy experiment in the guise of canal colonization. As a political economist, is always our fantasy to think about this project because, since Imran Ali's book, it's one of those great natural experiments that need to be studied. All we lack is good fine-grained data to probe that question. So what we do build on is this highly granular database, basically the Benazir Income Support Program database, which provides us fine-grained village-level outcomes. In fact, sub-village level, we are doing settlement level work. And we use a regression discontinuity approach for identification, really looking at two types of methodologies, command area strategy and a relative elevation strategy, will explain in a little while. So its basic idea for that strategy is really to look at how regions that are just exposed to canals versus not just exposed to canal, right? And we leverage that variation to look at the impact of canal exposure on land inequality. The headline result is that the more exposure you have to canal colonization, there's a sudden jump in inequality. The size is rather modest, but it's a very sustained and significant jump in inequality. We are in the process of compiling data for think about the mechanisms, but a lot of that work builds on collection of historic data sets that could allow us to probe this question in more detail. Now, I think I've got about 10 minutes to explain this. There's a lot of rich empirical material here. So I'm going to flip through many slides and really build a broader narrative that allows you to appreciate the kind of results we're doing. I'm going to skip all of this material because this is an audience that is very well versed with what happened under the British. This was the largest geographically contiguous irrigation scheme in the world. And there's a lot of historical literature that talks about it. Whitcomb's earlier study, for example, talked about how this irrigation scheme was the greatest in the world by length, number, aggregate miles, as well as a whole range of metrics. This was, a massive, massive infrastructural intervention through which large tracts of land were directly brought under cultivation. There's obviously a lot of historic literature on this subject, which has been, there for a long time, but we haven't been able to explore the impact partly because of absence of data. Let me begin with this slide. I think this is a crucial slide for thinking about the mechanism and the larger analytical frame. What we are arguing in this paper is that canal colonization, much like Sam Bowles argued, represented a dual shock. It was a shock to technology, because there was a shift from labor limited to land limited agriculture. And so it's a kind of transition from rain fed to irrigated agriculture, which meant there was a lot more importance of land in agriculture. But it was at the same time a shock to politics and institutions, which means that you had a sort of the state had a greater agency to define who owns property rights, who can use them, how they're to be alienated. And that means there's increased control of elites on the agricultural surplus. Now, this then connects to this kind of radical redistribution of economic and political power under the British in what presently constitutes Punjab. So that's the kind of radical redistribution of economic and political power here. Now, a key process, a fundamental element that underpinned this process, we argue, is the Zaildari system. And what's interesting is that the Zaildari system was set up around the same time that these canals were being set up. And so I will have a lot more to say about it when we reach the part of the presentation where we talk about mechanisms. So this shaped initial inequality. And in the absence of any major redistributive reforms in this country, we argue, and because of the increasing returns process, this inequality persisted, this kind of sustained increase in inequality. And perhaps, although we are unable to distinguish between these two types of mechanisms, there's obviously intergenerational transmission of wealth. A lot of the earlier landed elites would have passed on land to their subsequent generations, but also because the underlying institutional incentive structure where the holders of land had access to bureaucratic system and political power, including the way irrigation water is dispensed, would basically entrench inequality and shape contemporary land inequality. Now, just to zoom past, I'm going to skip this stuff on related literature and really take you through these two specifications that we use for identification purposes. The idea is really that canal exposed and unexposed regions are going to differ on a variety of different perspectives. So you need to compare units that are sufficiently close to each other. One is exposed, the other is unexposed. One strategy is to look at the distance of the particular settlement, village, hamlet, from the closest from the boundary of the command area. So the command area was based on engineering consideration way back in time under the British. So you really compare units that are, spatial units that are inside the command area versus outside the command area. Standard regression discontinuity setup with a vector of geophysical controls. We include 100-kilometer border segment fixed effects. Local linear specification as per Gelman and Imban. So very standard setup. And then for robustness, we also look at Sam Asher's research strategy for India, where they devise a relative elevation strategy, because canal exposure can be determined and is in fact largely determined through elevation. So if you're slightly below, the settlement centroid is slightly below the closest point to the nearest canal, it's exposed, and if it's slightly above, it's obviously unexposed. So we use that strategy as well to explore the impact of canal exposure on inequality. An interesting thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about a scheme that was built way back in time. And obviously, a lot of these irrigation schemes were built during the British. There was some extension under the Indus River, Basin System Authority, and the Tonsa Barrage system, etc. But it's still till 1959. So a lot of this is historical, and it's based on engineering considerations. A lot of the effort really went into creating settlement level shapefiles. We are now going to do MOSA level and Union Council level as well. But a key problem for researchers in this country is we don't have very finely grained administrative spatial units for this kind of analysis. So a lot of our effort was really to build this settlement level shapefile. This is a quick visual representation of the canal system and the settlements in it. Here you could look at our canal exposure variables across the two estimation strategies. The data is really sort of georeference data for the Benazir Income Support Program. It's a 2-page poverty card survey, and a benefit of it is that it also has information on land. Do you own agricultural land? And if so, how much? It's representative. Obviously, it doesn't include the very extremely high landowners, but it's captures more than 90% of the population. And there are a number of other data sets that we compile in that process. We have 3 measures of land inequality. The one is the standard Gini coefficient of land inequality, which we construct both for land owning households only, and one measure that includes land owning and landless as well. We also construct Piketty style measures, the share of land in a village hamlet that's in the top 30% of the households. We also use the asset index because the BISP has information about what assets they own, and although it's binary, we construct an indicator, a similar sort of coefficient of asset inequality. And what we are going to show is that across all these measures, as you move from just unexposed to just exposed canal settlements, you see a jump in inequality. So that's the sort of headline results. In general, what I'm going to show is that there is obviously, for statistical validity, we need to show that there are lots of other factors on which there is a good balance, so that these regions are comparable to each other. Then we're going to show that canal exposed regions in general have more land under cultivation, which is obvious by definition, greater acreage devoted to cash crops. So clearly there's a lot more extractable surplus here now, and higher agricultural productivity, along with this evidence of increased inequality. Okay, so I've got about 2 minutes to take you through much of this. These are the balance tests. We really look at ruggedness, rice, wheat suitability, temperature, soil. On most of these accounts, there's a kind of good balance. And we show that if you're inside the command area, in general, you have agricultural productivity in different seasons, Rabi and Kharif seasons, is higher. And then the main outcome of interest is kind of land inequality, which we show that canal exposed regions generally had higher land inequality. So here are some of RD plots which show us that as this is the distance to boundary, this is the running variable, and you could see that on the left-hand side, we have the Gini coefficient of land inequality among all households. So as you move from just outside to just inside the command area, there's actually quite a sharp jump in land inequality, and it's quite precisely estimated in both of these contexts. For those who own land, obviously, asset inequality is also important, and we find that there's also higher asset inequality in canal-exposed regions. Piketty-style measures, very similar evidence. If you look at these different commodities, cotton, rice, and wheat, again, there's greater proportion of land devoted to the cultivation of these cash crops. Now, similar result for the relative elevation strategy. If I had time, I could have taken you through it. And there's a standard set of tests that you could do to think about various types of statistical robustness tests to demonstrate that these results are quite significant and stable. What are the possible mechanisms? This is a stage that we are just beginning to do work on. So I'll provide you a very quick preview, maybe stealing another 2 minutes to just go through this sort of work. one idea here is really thinking more about historical patterns. So Zaildari's system was key to understanding the entrenchment of inequality because the Zails were really determined as a spatial unit and an administrative unit, which coincided more or less with the local social structure. Typically, a Zail consisted of 5 to 40 villages. They would be defined along social, kinship groups or particular kinds of tribes, and they would allow the British to select leads more easily, who were natural heads of those regions. And of course, a lot of these Zaildars were not just collecting revenue; they were also involved in the management of irrigation water. So the first thing we did was to go to the British Library in London and in Oxford and digitize all the Zale level shapefiles. So we constructed Zale level shapefiles and show that if we were to restrict our analysis to that unit, we again find that in the historical Zales, we have higher land inequality. Historical Zales that are exposed to canals have higher land inequality on different measures. So this is just as a segue to historic workers to kind of see historic boundaries, same result. And of course, at the tehsil level, you can begin to collect data on land revenue. So we collected data on land revenue at the tehsil level, and we can show that the more exposed a tehsil is to canals, so proportion of irrigated land is higher, which is the x-axis, the higher is the land revenue per capita, which is giving you a sense of the greater ability to extract exportable surplus from the revenue surplus from this. But there were fewer Zaildars. As there's greater canal exposure, there were fewer Zaildars appointed to extract. So you find some concentration of power. We now want to extend this analysis not onto tehsils, but actually historic Zail boundaries in 1891. And we've collected the data, so we're going to carry out that analysis at that level. We then also want to look at what role politics play in it, for which we have been collecting a lot of data on historic elites. These are basically elites that are recognized by British district gazetteers, by different types of historic documents. And we have elaborate information about these different political elites of Punjab from 1921 all the way down to 2018. And so some work that we are playing around with here, we are looking at 3 election rounds, 2002, 8, and 13. And in each of these, if you look at a Zamindar family or a historic family who were mentioned in District Gazetteer, in general, there is a higher probability of winning in elections. But the more canal exposed a constituency is, that probability increases quite significantly. Same for 2008, same for 2013, similar patterns we find. So we are now continuing to do more work, and part of this is to actually collect data, polling station level data on elections. And so we are thinking that at that unit, again, we could look at whether the political patterns vary in canal exposed polling stations versus other. Maybe we are trying to do too much, but we're trying to explore what type of political economy explanations might undergird this process of land inequality. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. If I can now ask Sultan Mehmood to discuss, give his comments. Do you have slides?
No.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Is this okay? So thank you, Adeel. It's always a pleasure to read your paper, especially they are so rich in history, which is something which many economists do not do. So while I was reading the paper yesterday night, I couldn't help thinking about like this new book of Robinson and it's Acemoglu and Johnson, Power and Progress, basically where they make the argument that whenever you have a technological development, you are going to have inequality generation. And one of the examples they give is the Industrial Revolution, where basically the Industrial Revolution in the UK led to not just a lot of economic development but a lot of inequality. So there is this built-in tendency of any large technological disruption to basically reinforce social hierarchies. So to interpret this in the broader literature would be very, very interesting. I think they end the book by talking about similar like artificial intelligence and whether this will also increase inequality or not. So if you want to position the paper more like in the current debate, maybe you can talk about, okay, like there are this inequality generating technological innovations, and so this canal expansion was just one of them. So that's one way to just think or interpret the findings which you have gone. The other thing which I would go would be, so now coming specifically to the paper, like, so for example, you have found like canal exposed places. These places have higher productivity, but at the same time, higher inequality as measured by land inequality and asset inequality. So now how do we interpret it? So one direction which might be interesting is, I think you already are going through there to look at the long run inequality, is how does it affect inequality today? And like, for example, how many of those people are like the ones which was mentioned by Shahidur Rahman in his Who Owns Pakistan, right? So who are these people who basically were gained land then, and what are their position now, like not just in politics but also in wealth, if it's possible to do so. So that's number one. Number two is to, maybe you want to also challenge the straightforward linear relationship between canal expansion and productivity growth. If you like, try to see both the short run effects, which has been documented well, that okay, canal expansion really increased economic development, but what about the long run effects when when wealth becomes very concentrated, from Piketty and all these people, we know that concentration of wealth can also be productivity stifling. So what is there a non-linear relationship between increase in land inequality on productivity growth in the short run, but in the long run actually it suppresses income? So these things could kind of add more richness potentially to the paper. But overall, I think the whole canal expansion project is one of the biggest in the world. So having some so bringing data to this age old question is of course going to interest a lot of people. Thanks.
Lisa, would you like to respond first, or should we take maybe a couple?
Maybe we collect questions and
have a question, sir.
Firstly, I'll appreciate the way the canal system and inequality has been, well, actually, data has been collected to look at the effect of it. But let's look at from this, if you can comment on that, that whether the route of the canal was something purely technical, or in terms of selection, were there some political influencer intended future influence which was used to route the canals? The reason I'm questioning it, today we can look into the infrastructure, selection of infrastructure in a certain area also has a back linkages to influence or a future benefits of that, and whether this technology are benefiting from a certain productivity has those linkages at that level or not. Did you could find in your study or not? Thank you.
Hi, Adeel. This is fascinating work. I had some questions regarding the canal colonies. In my understanding, there were like 9 of them, and each of them had different incentives. And like these areas were areas where a lot of people did not live. So there was a lot of migration that happened. So like, how does that selection impact your like estimation strategy? And like one thing that you mentioned is that a lot of these land rights. I mean, some of the land rights were given to elites. So were these elites the ones living in the command area versus other people living in the non-command area? So, and how the other thing that while I was reading a little bit on this work is that the British had maps in areas where they wanted to build these canals. So, could you kind of exploit in areas that they wanted to build but could not build? And can that help you get some causality in terms of like the outcomes? Thank you so much.
Perhaps so you'd like to respond maybe, and then we can take a second round of questions.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think this, the Power and Progress book is certainly on our mind. And it provides a nice hook into this debate. So that's very well taken. Your suggestion, Sultan, about thinking about, how many of the people actually were the beneficiaries of these processes. I think this is a larger question in historical political economy of persistence of what. And obviously there could be persistence of the elites, and some of that could certainly be part of the story. People who received lands kind of consolidated that, or witnessed less fragmentation over time. But I think there's also a story about persistence of the institutional incentive structure. So there may be new people buying land in certain canal areas, but they would be selecting into the same institutional incentive structure, which kind of persists over time. My feeling is that it's going to be slightly difficult to disentangle, but it's certainly worth looking at, to what extent elite persistence is part of that story. And your suggestion about the short-run effect and the non-linearity is also well taken. On political incentives, I think Imran Ali's book provides very deep answers to that question in a lot of historical literature, that the selection of the largest site for canal irrigation, being Punjab, was very much shaped, and the type of policies that were put in place were very much shaped by broader colonial motivations of protecting the frontier region, revenue extraction, military recruitment in this part of the world. And I was having discussion with Zara a little while ago. This kind of differed quite a bit from Bengal and other places as well. And in fact, other places in India where they built canals as well. So whilst there were broader political motivations, certainly, but where they would actually be able to lay out the canals is very much shaped by the gradient and the geographic engineering considerations. The scope for political action there is limited. Very good point about different canal colonies, because the British were building these canal colonies in different stages, and their imperial motivations were also changing a little bit as they went along. In some places, they wanted, especially around the time of the World War, they wanted to promote horse breeding grounds, and in those colonies, obviously, they were giving land in larger tracts. In Faisalabad, Lailpur colony, the land grants were smaller in size. So that's would all be part of our heterogeneity analysis to kind of perhaps create a shapefile for different. Maybe there won't be enough variation for us to produce well-identified results, but at least we could show that there might be differences in terms of the effect of canal exposure on inequality in different colonies, depending on those criteria. The other suggestion, yes, I mean that's the classic dream of any empirical researcher, that you could find a scheme that they wanted to build but didn't end up building. We couldn't find one so far, but probably worth exploring the archives more. More questions?
Assalamu alaikum, Adeel. Fascinating work. So I was just trying to understand the treatment variable that you have in these regressions. So you're talking about canal exposure. So how should we think about that? Is that a difference between the head village versus the tail village that you're comparing, or um,
Right. Maybe we could take if more questions.
and so sort of related to that, have you looked at, so building on that comment about these canal colonies being developed over a period of time? So it would also be interesting to look at the tenure conditions under which these grants were given. As you noticed, there were different grant types and different sizes of average size of land grant was also different in different colonies. So if you have maybe historic data on that, that would be good to also see okay, what was the initial land inequality like in these different colonies.
Okay. Yes.
Small comment. I may have missed out. What's the point of what? Why are we interested in that question of inequality in this region versus the other region? I would be more interested in the productivity issue. Where it's gone up or down, but why is this an issue? Sometimes it's of interest that increasing inequality has certain implications for economic growth and so on. But inequality in the command versus non-command and the differences in that, why is that of interest?
Just to supplement to that, is this inequality in land holding or inequality in income?
Land holding.
Last comment.
My comment comes from a fact that in migration of this takes place in somewhere in 1990 till 1924-25, and we have another migration in 1947. And my question is, could we also contribute a bit of the development and the progression towards the quality of manpower that was selected and then placed in these areas? And could we also look at the fact that if they were not placed, were they also well off where they were, East Punjab particularly? Because a lot of the skilled labor that came in were actually doing very well where they were settled. And it was the quality of manpower that actually could have contributed towards the wealth.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, first question. The running variable in the two regressions, one is really distance from the command boundary. And you could do various permutations of it, 15 kilometer, keep the buffer zone within 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers. And then if you are just inside versus just outside the command area boundary, and we have the shape files for the command area, so you could actually see which regions fall within that. The other one is the kind of relative elevation strategy where you have a settlement, a village hamlet, and you have the centroid of that settlement. There's a distribution of elevation in that settlement, and you look at the top 5th percentile of the distribution, and then you see the distance from the nearest point from the nearest canal, and then look at which regions have kind of negative values within that range. So whether they're just in terms of gradient have relative elevation that is below the nearest point in the nearest canal versus just above. So that's the running variable here. And in terms of tenure conditions and different grant types, that again is a dream that one could pursue. But unfortunately, a lot of that data is either too granular, like Ali Chima collected that for Sargodha, but doing that for the whole of province is difficult. But we are thinking about using historical literature to at least conduct some heterogeneity analysis on, here are these regions which have slightly different types of tenorial arrangements, and there was variation in tenorial arrangements in general. Why inequality? Yeah, I mean, there are a number of reasons we can think about. I mean, agricultural productivity is one, but because in this part of the world you had irrigation experiment which very closely aligned with the larger social and political experiment, with the creation of the Zeldari system, with who received land. This becomes an important question. It also becomes an important question because if you read Imran Ali's book, he ends by extrapolating the significance of his book for the larger question of development, and he talks about how canal colonization set in stage a process of political economy of growth without development. There's also literature, and you are, along with Anjum, Naseem Saab, as well as Naved Hamid Saab, you've done a lot of work around agriculture. And the benefits of green revolution, again, some of the evidence that we have suggests that they were also concentrated amongst people who had, higher holdings of land. So inequality matters that way, and inequality also matters because those who had initially water rights had land rights, and they continue to shape the way irrigation system works. You just have to go to the irrigation department and look at who the ministers are. Right from the British times up till now, they're mostly members of large landed aristocracy. So how the manner in which the water system, the entire bureaucracy works, it works to the advantage of more entrenched elites or people who are landholders. So for all those reasons, it's important, especially if you're thinking about the political economy impact beyond agricultural productivity, then those questions become a lot more important. The question about migration, obviously, a key challenge in historical studies is historical compression, because there's long time has elapsed, and you need to connect the past with the present. I think a lot of the migration really took place in urban areas, a lot more people coming and settling down. There were also rural migration, and certainly we can do heterogeneity analysis. A lot of families received land grants in South Punjab, in Bahawalpur, Bahawalnagar. And those grantees obviously were migrants, settlers from East Punjab. We could look at those patterns. Certainly there might be some interesting differences to explore.
I want to know about the Indus Water Treaty. What impacts our canal system in Punjab as well? What the Indus?
I mean, your expert, the director of the Water Center, from whom I've learned a great deal, Dr. Muhammad Abu Bakr, sitting here, he can tell you after this session. But I think the larger impact, which I understand, is that it basically systematized they created a system whereby you could transfer water across rivers. So that was, if I'm not mistaken, that was the major contribution of that, is going to stabilize water flow in the face of the new allocations between India and Pakistan. And obviously the Tonsa barrage system, again, was a kind of extension. But by and large, it was more about systematizing the distribution of water and managing the flow of water between rivers through link canals.
I think that's all the time we have.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Sultan Mehmood, who'll be talking about reform, multiplier, and elite entrenchment.
Who will put it?
Good.
So, hello. Yeah, I'll try to stay at one place. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, so welcome. Today I'm going to present this paper, the reform multiplier and elite entrenchment. And as usual, this will hopefully be a controversial and provocative paper. So the main important part is, so the other day we talked about what is wrong with the judiciary. So in the NAP courts over the last 40 years, what we did wrong with the judiciary. Today I'm going to talk about what we did right with the judiciary. And I think it has very deep link with the 26th Amendment, that we reversed things, not what was wrong with the judiciary, but what was right with the judiciary. So this paper is going to present evidence in a way against the 26th Amendment. And to do that, first, let me argue why judiciary is important. So we know from old Babas like Douglas North and these people Asamoglu, Robinson, that judiciary is important because they are the ones who protect our economic rights and they protect our political rights. So yeah, okay, that's fine. But I think there is a deeper question which they miss, is why judiciary is important, because judiciary is the anchor which makes sure other structural reforms and other institutional transformations take place efficiently. So think of it like this, like if a country is trying to make an independent election commission, they want to do election reforms, you need an independent judiciary from the government. If a government tries to protect the consumers, or tries to do financial regulations, they need a judiciary not captured by the corporations. So an independent judiciary is kind of a linchpin which ties together other reforms which the government wants to do. So this is why judiciary is extremely important. So among reforms, that's why it's extremely important, and we have to be really careful what judges go into the system. So that selection of judges in this is extremely important. And I'm going to talk about this watershed judge selection reform, which happened in 2010, which changed the selection procedure of judges. So the reform went from, so before 2010, you had the president, the prime minister mainly, on the advice of Chief Justice of Pakistan, making the judge selection. And after 2010, you had the Judicial Commission of Pakistan, consisting mostly of judges themselves making judge selections. So I'm going to present three sets of results. One, what happened to the independence of judiciary from the government because of this reform in the short run and the long run. The second thing I'm going to talk about is, okay, is, for example, more independence of judiciary good? What happened to the quality of judicial decisions? So were these decisions actually better? And finally, what might be the cost of giving the judiciary a lot of power in making judge selections? So for example, what happened to elite entrenchment at this time? And then I think even a bigger and more complicated question, should we have done it given the costs? So it's not a mystery novel, so yes, we should have done it. So, okay, so the question is, so just to summarize the three results of my paper with Ali, who is a PhD student in Aix-Marseille, is, so this judge selection reform increased judicial independence from the government in both the short run and long run. And actually, in the long run, there is a cascade effect. Its effect was increasing over time. So that's what I call the reform multiplier. The second result is, at the same time, the reform, so judges, when they were making judge selection from their own, they had almost the sole power of making judge selections. They were hiring more judges from their former law chambers. So judges started hiring more and more from their own former law chambers. But what I argue is, even when they were doing it, this was much better than when the executive branch used to make the judge selection. So the quality of judicial decisions improved relative to executive appointment nonetheless. So these are the three main results. Now, again, I'm not going to present it like an economics paper. So this paper is an R&R in AEJ Applied. So you can read that full paper for the identification checks. I have an identification strategy which basically uses judges' 62nd birthday as an instrument for new judicial appointments. So what's the background? So this reform was basically a baby of the lawyers movement. So in 2007 to 2009, we had the lawyers movement. General Pervez Musharraf thought that dictators have infinite power, when that's not the case. No dictator has infinite power. There are institutional constraints to every authoritarian regime. And so he basically roughed up the Chief Justice, and then there was this movement by the civil society, lawyers, some people from behind the scenes, and then you had the restoration of the judiciary. And one of the things which the judiciary and the lawyers pushed for was the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of Pakistan. So I won't go into the details of the difference between, say, the 18th and 19th Amendment to the Constitution of Pakistan, but essentially, I'm looking at the effect of 19th Amendment to the Constitution of Pakistan, where judges got an overwhelming majority for judge selection. So 18th Amendment had some parliamentary oversight, and the 19th Amendment was basically making the judiciary having a majority in the judge selection, an overwhelming majority relative to the 18th Amendment, which was something similar to what we have now. So how was this happening? So the Judicial Commission of Pakistan, mostly senior judges, made the judge selections, and they decided judges based on majority voting. So the 9 senior most Supreme Court justices plus the senior most High Court justices would make the judge selections for the higher courts and the Supreme Courts. So just to show you, so this is a simplified version of the selection process. There was also Attorney General and the Law Minister, but they were not in the majority. But we can discuss the complications later. So what do we see? So what do we exploit? We use the fact that it didn't happen that when this 19th Amendment came, all the previous judges were just fired and sent home. Actually, the system was gradually filled with more and more judges appointed by the Judicial Commission. So that's number one thing you see. And one thing you see is that immediately when these judges from committee appointments enter the system, the state wins or pro-government rulings falls. Sorry that this is a complicated graph. There are 2 y-axes for those who are confused. Yeah, it's put in purposely to confuse you. Yeah. So just going to the empirical method. So I won't go too much into the equations. I will just tell you the logic of the empirical strategy. So the empirical strategy, so you can have new judicial appointments endogenously. The empirical strategy we use is using the 62nd birthday as an instrument, and it's not assuming that reaching your 62nd birthday and retiring after that is exogenous, because you can have anticipation. What it is assuming is that in non-reform years, say in 2009, a judge reaches her 62nd birthday and replacement is chosen by, say, the Prime Minister. And in 2010, a judge reaches her 62nd birthday and the replacement is chosen by a judicial commission. So in this sense, we are assuming not that reaching the 62nd birthday has no anticipation effect. You are actually just showing that the effect is similar in non-reform years and in reform years. So then using this instrument, you basically estimate this DID-IV equation, where you have the short run effect and the long run effect. You have the bunch of fixed effects, district fixed effects, year fixed effects, bench fixed effects even, because this is case level data. So then, okay, again, I don't want to, because I know they're not just economists here, so I'm very mindful of that. So I'm just going to skip the equation. You can read the paper, it's 81 pages long, so there is a lot of empirics there. So what are the results? Number one result is the reform had a persistent long-run effect on reducing pro-government rulings. So any econometric method you use, you see that pro-government rulings fall over time. Second is, it's not just that, there is also a potential cost to this. So I say potential, it will become clear that you have given the power of judge selection to judges themselves. So how do they make the judge selection? So do you have a concentration of judges when you give the appointment authority to judges? To do that, this is a real example. So we construct a judicial elite network So all the serving right now and also previous judges are in it. We use 720 judges and construct a network using law firms where these judges came from and see whether these judges who are in the Judicial Commission, whether they are a drawing from their pool of their law firms. So as an example, you had Justice Umar Atta Bandial, the Chief Justice. When he was the Chief Justice, he elevated Justice Aisha A. Malik as the first female Supreme Court Justice. So the question is, you have this higher, did these judges who were selected by a judicial commission when they came in, whether these hiring committee hired more from their networks? And we find this to be the case as well. So you have more hiring from the same networks when they make the judge selections. So you have more same law firm people now in the system than they were before. Now, there will be a difference in, I don't know, political scientists and economists when they see this result. Like, I think political scientists will immediately say, clientelism literature, right? Like, okay, this is clientelism. But now I think also political scientists have thought about it. And when an economist will say it, they will think of it in terms of informational economics. Well, it's ambiguous whether hiring from the same law firm is good or bad. It might be the case that you hire the incompetents of the incompetents, your dumb friend who is loyal to you. And that's number one way to think about it. But at the same time, it's also possible that you have more information from your law firm. You have more information about the person. So imagine you are in a large law firm. There is a possibility that you have the highest information of who is the best, who could be the best judge. So you could select a better judge based on your information relative to what the president or the prime minister is selecting, because he doesn't have this information. And also he might have perverse incentives to make sure that he selects judges who are most loyal to the regime. So there is this, it's theoretically ambiguous. Actually, I do a lot of work to try to disentangle this, but I'm going to just present you one of these results, which is what happens to the quality of judicial decisions after when these same law judge hires come in. And so the two measures I'm going to show here, I do more quality measures, is basically how many decisions are on the merits of the case, so on the evidence is cited in the case, and how many decisions follow due process of law. So what's the rating on the due process of law by these judges? The third thing I do is also I look at facts cited per page. So how many facts a judge cites per page, that's what lawyers tell us, especially constitutional lawyers, that's an indicator of quality of judicial decisions. Third, how influential is that judgment? So are the judges who are commission appointed, are their stuff getting cited more than judges who are appointed by the executive? And in all these four instances, we find that actually after the judge selection reform, you have it's not just that the pro-government rulings fall, decisions on case merits increase, decision on due process of law increases, facts per pages increases, citation of your judgments increase. So that's just one thing. You might think, okay, that's well and good. What about corporate capture? So are these judges now they're not captured by the government, but maybe they are captured by large corporations now. So what I do is basically I divide cases where the state is opposing a firm, and I define firms as, say, small and medium firms versus large firms which are connected to Shahidur Rahman's 35 conglomerate. So actually Adeel bhai once told me about this, and so he told me to read these books, and then in this there is this 35 companies which basically I see in the data how many times these 35 companies come in, and then I see whether is the new committee appointees more lenient towards these large corporations. And actually the effect we find is opposite, that the state is more likely to win when it's facing these large firms. At least suggestively, the evidence is there. So it's not that these judges are more independent from the government. It might even be the case that these judges are more difficult to be captured by corporations relative to. Again, this is not that I'm saying that like heaven has come on earth. It's just that all relative to executive appointments. So you also have lawyers capture. So okay, I won't go into this. So just to conclude, the judge selection reform had a cascade. So this 2010 judge selection reform, which reduced executive influence from the judiciary in judge selection and made a commission of judges making the judge selection, increased judicial independence from the government. And it also at the same time led to an increased hiring from judge networks. However, still you saw the decision quality increased. And actually, I show that the quality of these committee appointed judges have different characteristics. They are more experienced. So committee appointed judges hires more people who are more experienced, have a longer law firm, they have been longer in the law profession. They also have more cited judgments. So one of the things, so there are this thing called reported judgments. Means that the judges whose laws are more are reported in the cases, so they have more reported judgments. So it's likely that the selection led to more qualified judges, again relative to executive appointment. So diminishing executive influence in judge selection improves judicial autonomy, and even when it consolidates hiring within judge network. So if you want to if you had blanked out completely on my presentation, were too focused on my looks, it's okay. You can just see these two takeaways, which is diminishing executive control in judge selection has a multiplier effect on judicial independence and decision quality. And this happens even when it creates a highly concentration judicial elite. That's the two takeaways from the long paper. I've not covered everything, but I'm happy to answer questions if you might have them. Thank you very much for this.
Issue or seen as a problem in the first place, because I mean, even as academics, I mean, everybody who works in the field does know better people. For instance, I am right now with the government. I was first with IBA, and the government needed a head of policy and research, and because of my work experience at the IBA, I was able to connect a top impact evaluator. And I think, I mean, did I know that person? Of course I did. I worked 4 years with him. But at the same time, they did not strengthen the government to get the best person. So, I mean, this assumption that judge, I mean, the results that you show, it has a word that yet the judges hired judges, yet it had so I think the word yet is a little.
Just like a very small comment. So I obviously agree with you because you are going right with my results. And I think this is more general point, like in, for example, my university did an extremely great hiring by not just hiring me, but like doing so the professors themselves hire professors. So it's not a thing which is like unheard of, but a lot of people actually in Pakistan especially, they worry, or maybe it's just propaganda, that actually these judges, they're hiring their friends, so this is extremely bad. So whenever you will hear he came from his chamber, it's said in the way of derision. So maybe I'm speaking more to the lawyers community than the academic community here, because yeah. Yeah, so well then executive and see how bad it can get, like so if you think this is bad, just give it to the prime minister and president, then you then you will know. Thanks. Okay, so now we know.
All right. Thanks. So I very much enjoyed reading the paper. I think it's quite well polished. authors have done a good job, I think, of I think have a solid estimation strategy. They've done a lot of robustness checks and also considered alternate explanations as well, which we'll sort of get to. So I want to sort of so I don't have sort of overly critical comments, just make a few minor observations. I think the paper comes at a very pertinent time given the most recent constitutional amendments, so to sort of circle back to. So just to sort of summarize, as Sultan mentioned in his presentation, so the basis of the paper is this 19th constitutional amendment in 2010, which transferred the authority of who gets appointed a Supreme Court or High Court judge from the executive, from the Prime Minister or the President, to a judicial commission consisting of the Supreme Court Justice, I think the most senior Supreme Court justices, as well as the relevant High Court justices, right? And in the paper, they consider what the effect of this reform was on three outcomes. So they look at judicial independence, which they measure as the number of state wins in high court cases in which the state is a party. They also look at what Sultan is calling elite entrenchment, or sort of concentration of judges in this judicial commission, which they measure by looking at whether the new addition to the judicial commission came from the same law firm as at least one other existing judge on the judicial commission. And finally, they look at the quality of decisions, which they measure in two ways at least. So the first thing they look at is a binary variable, whether the case was decided on merits as opposed to, say, just technical grounds, which seems to be a common approach that sometimes judges take to support the government. So that's a binary variable. And then there's this, what they call whether due process of law was followed, a categorical, so a variable that goes from, say, 1 to 5. The way they got these measurements was they hired a law firm, which consisted, or two law firms, I guess, which consisted of two teams of lawyers who went through all of these cases and then, gave them a judgment on whether it was decided on case merits or not, right? So this sort of just a summary of what the paper looks at. In terms of the estimation strategy, I'm borrowing this figure from the paper itself, which I think is a nice representation of what they're trying to do. So pre-2010, you have appointments to the Supreme Court and to the High Courts by the executive branch, the Prime Minister or the President. In 2010, the reform happens. And then if you look at the second sort of picture, you've got the Judicial Commission, which primarily consists of judges who are appointed by the executive, right? And as they retire, because of the mandatory retirement age of 62, they're going to be replaced by what the authors call these first generation of judges, which are appointed by judges which were appointed by the executive. So they're one step removed from the executive, right? And as more and more judges retire, the Judicial Commission, the composition of the Judicial Commission changes, consisting more of these first generation judges who've been appointed by the executive, right? And ultimately you have a Judicial Commission then, which consists of, judges appointed by judges, right? Which is what the authors call the second generation of judges, right? And what they refer to as the reform multiplier effect is to look at the difference of having sort of first generation judges in the majority of the Judicial Commission versus, say, second generation judges as a majority of the Judicial Commission, and to see what impact that has on state wins. And they find that the coefficient for whether you're a second generation, whether there's a second generation majority, is much larger than if this is the first generation. So this is what they call the cascading effect or the multiplier effect of the reform, right? So they do, it's also nice to see that, they do a DID, but they also implement an events study design as well, just to sort of check the parallel trends assumption. That's critical for doing a DID. So that was nice to see. They also do a battery of robustness checks. So here's one example. You might think that the number of state wins might be correlated with the type of case involved. So here's an example where they remove, the category of the case in which the state is a party. So criminal benches with, property benches, cases involving tax or cases involving writ. And again, you see a persistent effect, so it's sort of robust. The coefficient for second generation judges is much larger for the first generation, right? So again, the sort of multiplier effect of the reform, that's what they're calling it, right? One observation or sort of brief comment that I had over here is that my understanding is that in the High Court, of course, they look at sort of first instances of citizens or private parties coming to the judiciary for resolution of conflict. But the High Court also acts as an appellate, has appellate jurisdiction, which means that they look at appeals or revisions to cases made by some subordinate courts, right? So one question that might come up is, well, what's the composition of, in their sample, what's the composition of, say, appeals versus first instances? Because you could imagine if the High Court division bench is looking at sort of appeals, there might be a tendency to look at the merits of the case. So might there be a confounding factor there with regards to their second result or sort of third result about quality of decision? So that's one observation. The third sort of observation has to do with alternative explanations that might explain the results or sort of were perceived to be positive results. So they look at, for example, might there be peer effects? Might second generation judges be affecting the decisions made by executive appointment judges or first generation judges? And they find that that's not a big concern. Judges might be acting based on career prospects. So if they're, for example, concerned about getting promoted to the Supreme Court, they look at that and find that there's no evidence to support that. They do concede that judge ideology might have a small sort of role to play here. In terms of ideology, they define judges in terms of two groups, what they call the professionals group, and the second group, I believe, is sort of the progressives or the Asma Jahangir group. And they find that there's sort of a difference there. So ideology might have a role, albeit a small one, to play in terms of the outcomes or the change in the outcomes there. So it's good that at least they note that. To that point, I think one thing that you sort of touch on this in your preliminary observations, but one thing that you would note is that this reform happens in 2010, which is sort of right in the middle of the tenure of Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry, which is from 2007 to 2013 when he was the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And so just before the 2010 reform, I think you've got two other key moments that have happened, right? So of course, there's the 2007 lawyers movement, which came as a result of Pervez Musharraf suspending Iftikhar Chaudhry. And you sort of have this wave, I think, of judicial activism that starts off in 2007 and to some extent maybe perhaps persists. You also have in 2009 a Supreme Court case which declared unconstitutional the 2007 state of emergency, as well as the PCO, the Provisional Constitutional Order that was initiated by Pervez Musharraf, right? So there's this question of, well, you've got these two other perhaps watershed events that are also happening, right? Where you just have this wave of judicial activism that's spearheaded by the senior most judge in the country, Iftikhar Chaudhry, who sort of also had a tendency to sort of use very liberally, the suo motu authority that the Supreme Court Chief Justice had. And so there's this question of, well, might there be a confounding factor there in the sense of, could there be, for example, a role model effect, right? Could High Court judges be taking examples from this sort of wave of judicial independence that was initiated by Iftikhar Chaudhry? So that's something I think that might be food for thought that perhaps Sultan could address. And then finally, in all of this, I think it's worth thinking about also, how we might think about now the 26th constitutional amendment, which I interpret almost as a way of partially reversing what the 19th constitutional amendment does, right? In the paper, the authors talk about, I think, a couple of cases of reforms which have gone in the opposite direction of the 2010 amendment. I think you mentioned I think, reforms in Russia and Hungary and China, right, where there's a sort of crackdown. And so it might be sort of worth thinking about, how you might expect things to evolve in terms of the outcomes that have been discussed in the paper. So I'll stop here and then open up for questions to the audience. I think we have a question there at the back. Maybe take a couple of questions and then, so the ma'am at the back and then.
Hi, sorry, I had to change my question a little bit after you discussed your comments. But so I really wanted to know that since you already mentioned that there might be some confounding factors having an impact, such as the movements that were discussed. So do you think that over the years, since these movements have become like an important part of the situation within the country, like how do you basically intend to disentangle the impact of these movements on judicial reform from the broader contextual elements that have, been an active part of what's been happening around us? And within that, do you think that like if we incorporate different interaction terms for political or institutional shocks or changes by applying whatever, as in you're already using a difference in difference model, but do you think using like a more advanced version of it would help isolate the impact that these movements have had versus what impact the judicial reforms themselves have created over the years? And again, if you could also elaborate on the discussant's comments about confounding factors, particularly unobserved ones, that would be great. Thank you.
Another question over here.
Thank you. In Pakistan's history, we had three type of courts. For example, loyal court since independence and legitimizing military, dictatorship, and then confrontational court and assertive court. Judicial behavior basically is shaped by two principles: legal preferences and policy preferences. And how can you explain when judiciary basically legitimizing the military dictatorship, and what were the primary preferences, legal or policy preferences?
Could we take maybe one more, Sultan, and then wanna start?
Thank you, Sultan. Really great paper. I have maybe slightly like a normative kind of a question, is that when we think about independent judiciary, what do we actually mean? I mean, judiciary is a part of state, and let's say there are the judgments against the state, and I consider that as an independent judiciary, or maybe certain cases that are from the government side or maybe from the influentials within the government, and there are the judgments against that, we consider that as an independence. And especially why I'm saying that, because post Iftikhar Chaudhry, there was that anger effect as well, so you messed up with me, and then we are going to give you a lot of judgments, even through the suo motu notices. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. So I will get the easiest question first, the role of the military. So, absolutely. One thing I think which is underappreciated is, and I'm right now looking at it in this paper, is actually these judges who were appointed by the Judicial Commission were not all pro-military. The 6 judges letter which came, all of these judges were appointed by the Judicial Commission. And if you read other books, people have documented it except Pakistani. There is this guy, Mark Mazzetti, who wrote this book, The Way of the Knife. And he was basically reporting for the New York Times for the Raymond David case and all this. And he wrote this mercurial courts of Lahore, the ISI chief, Justice, I think Pasha at that time, was in the courtroom, he writes. and he was the most powerful. He was one of the most powerful people in Pakistan. He writes, but he didn't know what would happen. So there is resistance within the system, you know. So I hope I didn't touch on anything sensitive like naming ISI chiefs and stuff. So okay, so second question is, was this Chief Justice specific effect? So this is what I have looked at carefully. So you can actually horse race the reforms effect relative to, say, the executive appointment for different Chief Justices. And you find that actually every time it outperforms in terms of decision quality and independence any Chief Justice. So of course there is heterogeneity here, and Chaudhary Saab has the largest coefficient. But but at the same time, that's something to recognize. Talking about Chaudhary Saab okay, let me say something more, another controversial thing. So Chaudhary gets a lot of flack here. You know, he helped Arsalan, his son. He did a lot of things. He did many things which were very, very objectionable. The judicial activism, the samosa prices, and something which even worse, you know, he tried to interfere in like this Hatika or Do's wine bottle and stuff. So he has really upset me. But when his moment came in history and 4 people told him to resign, he didn't resign. So history is going to judge him not only in terms of what he did wrong, but also what he did right. So that's also something we have to think about. Okay, so let's get less political now. So coming to the lawyers movement and the, okay, let's get super technical then. First of all, I want to thank you for making this. So it's really great that you did the technical part and I did the more like substantive conceptual part. So in this sense, so whether it's confounded by other stuff like the lawyers movement is something which we take on from the first page. You know, whether it's something else, and we try to rule out every explanation. And one of the ways we do it is not just to use a simple DID, but use a very intuitive instrument, which is, think of it like this. You have a bench. In some benches, in some years, you will have more 60-second birthdays relative to less. So we use this variation in your 60-second birthdays, which is correlated with retirements and new appointments, and we show that this is balanced across a host of baseline social characteristics, political characteristics, economic characteristics. So places, for example, where the Chief Justice visited in the lawyers movement, it's uncorrelated with that, for example, our estimator. So the key here is like, you do a bunch of placebo tests and balance checks in addition to the parallel trends, which would violate if it was indeed the case that that we were confounding the effect. So again, and also one more thing, we use district bench fixed effects. So we are comparing not just across districts, we are comparing 2 judges within a bench. One judge is appointed by the executive, and the other judge is selected by the Judicial Commission. So it's a really, really tight treatment control comparisons. Okay, finally, suo moto. I know that would come up. So one thing I think it has to be clear, a priori, it's not clear if suo moto is bad. So, for example, one of the first suo moto cases ever taken was against bonded labor. And this led to a legislation which protected big like this, ye bhatte vagaira ke hote hain, to protect them against their rights. So suo moto in itself could be a very enfranchising and great thing, and it has been abused. But even then, you know, how many suo moto cases took place, for example, under the largest number is actually Saqib Nisar. So it was 220. The second largest is Iftikhar Chaudhary, 180, 183, I think. So that's a small fraction of cases if you really look at the High Court. So saying that we should like fundamentally dismantle the judiciary and just because suo moto power sometimes did bad things is not an argument against suo moto powers. So that's like the suo moto thing. Now, what else? I usually can't understand my handwriting, so I'll just stop here. So others' comments are scribbles.
I think we're out of time anyway.
Sir, I do agree with you about the promotions and selections of the judges, but previous practices, let us see, promotion by seniority, is it privilege from the system of the world? I have been working in National Power England, never see like this. The performance-oriented promotion is always there instead of seniority promotion. So do you think it is according to this?
So that's a great question. So how does the UK appoints judges? It's the UK Service Commission. It's extremely similar to what we had in the 19th Amendment. The only difference was that you had judges, but you also had law professors, you had human rights activists in the selection procedure. So what was needed not to kind of dismantle the judge selection procedure and give it to the executive, what was needed is you needed to make the selection panel more diverse and more competent. So that's what I would say. Again, the UK Service Commission is what the 19th and the 18th Amendment were based on. So it was very similar to the UK system of judge selection. Now, how the judges make selections after that, they have to look at the local context as well. You know, they can't just so there are pros and cons of the seniority principle. So the con is like, you know, just because you are old doesn't mean you are more competent. But at the same time, the war which can happen if this, like for example, if everybody is fighting to get the pie, this war in a Pakistani kind of society where latte khanchana is like the norm, this can really create a huge contestation, and that's what might happen here. So okay, thank you.
So I think maybe we started maybe 15 minutes late, so we'll try and finish by, let's say 2:45, but we'll see. Just as a disclaimer, the work that I'll be talking about is sort of has a focus more towards predictive inference as opposed to causal inference. So you won't see anything about DIDs or regression discontinuity designs or IVs or anything of that sort. I anticipate that there will be a lot of comments by Cory, who's a discussant about causal inference, and from the audience as well. So perhaps we can talk about that at that time. Okay, so really what the paper is about is modeling compositional data. What do I mean by compositional data? Take a vector of variables which are all between 0 and 1 and add up to 1. That's what we call compositional data. Such data is not uncommon in economic applications. So think about, for example, if you want to estimate consumer demand functions, you might look at budget shares. What proportion of a person's income are they spending on different categories of goods? If you're estimating production or profit functions, you might look at input factor shares. In agri-studies, you might care about yields and how it depends on, say, the composition of soil. What proportion of the soil consists of, say, sand versus clay, and so on and so forth, right? And so in the context of this paper, I'm thinking about modeling elections in terms of looking at election outcomes in terms of vote shares, right? So what share of the total turnout does a candidate get, right? And in this paper, I'll be talking about a particular parametric technique that has been used in other disciplines, not so much in economics or political science, which is called Dirichlet regression. You'll find out shortly why it's called that. And I do it in the context of election outcomes. I in particular look at US congressional district races, 4 cycles from 2010 to 2016. Congressional districts, or sort of the lower house. So each congressional district in the US is about 750,000 people. These elections are done, so the term is every 2 years. So I look at 4 cycles. And in the case of Pakistan, I look at the 2018 general elections. So I look at the the NA constituencies. The work on Pakistan is sort of, I'll try and spend more time on that because that I'm assuming that would be of interest to more people. It's very much a work in progress, so I'll sort of show some preliminary analysis on that front. Just a preview of results, the key sort of headline takeaway is that Dirichlet regression compared to sort of standard regression methods does a lot better in terms of explaining the overall variation in the data. So consider, for example, the R squared as a measure of goodness of fit. In the case of US House races, I look at, I have data on how much candidates are spending on advertising. So I look at that in particular. And I find 2 things. One, there's heterogeneity across parties. So for Democrats, advertising spending from their own pocket seems to have a much stronger effect than for Republicans. That translates approximately into a advertising cost per vote of about 2/3 for that of Republicans. Interestingly, third-party advertising that's done by sort of interest groups or PACs or super PACs has no significant effect on electoral outcomes, which is surprising somewhat, I would say, because in terms of scale, the third-party spending is a lot more than what candidates spend. And then finally, it turns out that district demographic characteristics are very good predictors of underlying voter preferences, right? And I'll sort of show, I won't show you a regression table, I'll show you sort of a picture which tries, I think, to illustrate that. Okay, so let me get into sort of the motivation a little bit more from a technical perspective. So think about, you want to estimate, say, the vote Y of candidate K in election J, and you want to estimate that as a function of, some observable characteristics X, your parameters beta, and usually we add this sort of structural error term epsilon. Here I've illustrated G as a log link function, but it need not be. It could be just a linear function, right? And the epsilon we usually assume is, say a standard normal with mean 0. If it's a multivariate, it's a multivariate normal with mean 0, and covariance variance matrix sigma, right? Note that implicitly, especially if you sort of have a structured model, we're making an implicit assumption about the data generating process, when we make these parametric assumptions, right? Why might that be of issue in some cases? Well, your estimates of epsilon may be highly non-normal when you do post-estimation analysis, right? And so from that perspective, the assumption of normality may not be justified. You might, the normal distribution is quite restrictive in some cases, right? And this may translate into, if you're thinking about, for example, estimating shares or proportions, you might get some very unreasonable estimates, right, or predictions. You might get values which are greater than 1 or less than 0, for example, right? As a very simple example, think of a linear probability model, right? There's also, if you're working with compositional data, I think there's a more serious problem or what's called a singularity issue, right? So think about, let's say if you've got a bivariate model, you've got 2 variables which sum up to 1 and are all between 0 and 1. Well, on the left-hand side, the y's have to add up to 1 for every observation. And so on the right-hand side, the beta x plus epsilon also has to add up to 1 for every observation, right? If the betas are meaningful, that must mean that you have to have a restriction that the beta x's have to sum up to 1, which has the implication that the epsilons for every observation have to add up to 0, which means that epsilon on the first component is just a linear combination of the other epsilons, right? And so what that would mean is that when you're estimating the covariance variance matrix, it would not be a full rank, and you would get a singular matrix. In practice, this has been well known for some time. In practical applications, the way that people deal with this is they ignore the problem and approximate it anyway. The other approach is to maybe say drop one equation and estimate the others. These seem to me to be both quite ad hoc. And so from that perspective, it might be better to sort of work with a distribution that's more appropriate for in this case, right? So here you might assume that the data generating process is given by a more flexible distribution. In my case, I'll be working with generalization of the beta distribution, which is called the Dirichlet distribution, hence the term Dirichlet regression. Okay. I'm going to skip this. The key part about the Dirichlet distribution, so that's what the probability density function looks like. The key parameter here of interest is this parameter alpha I, which determines the mean of every component. It's just for every component yk, the mean is just alpha k divided by the sum of the alphas. And so the idea behind Dirichlet regression is just to try and estimate that parameter alpha I for each of the components, in this case using a log link function. And we can do that using maximum likelihood. Okay, let me skip how I get the data for the US congressional district races. At the end, I have left 1,900 candidates or 950 congressional district races that I look at. Data on demographic characteristics are given by the American Community Survey. So here's just a summary statistic. On average, campaign contributions for each candidate is about $1.1 million. About 30% of that money is spent on advertising by candidates. So this is money that's coming out of their own pockets. Third-party advertising is about $320,000 in support, about 74,000 in support, about 330,000 against. They're actually much larger because you have a lot of cases where there's zero spending. So on scale, the third-party advertising is a lot more than advertising that's done by candidates. In terms of district demographic data, I know for each district, the number of males and females who are college educated, who have health insurance, as well as sort of median income and racial composition. Okay, so I can estimate also the abstention rate by just using the turnout and using the number of eligible voters in each district. At the end, I have a 3-variable system, the vote share for Democrats, the vote share for Republicans, and how many people abstain, or sort of the proportion of voters that abstain from voting. So I have a 3-variable system where I can always represent one variable as a combination of the other two. So that means I can represent an election outcome in a 2-dimensional simplex. So this is really where you want to sort of maybe spend more time thinking about this. So this is much easier than it would initially appear. This is a triangle. Each point on the triangle represents an election outcome. So for example, imagine a case where everybody votes and everybody votes Democrat. That would be this blue point over here. A case where everybody abstains from voting would be a point over here. And so you would imagine the interesting cases would be somewhere in the interior of this triangle, right? Think about this black dot. That represents an election outcome where 50% abstain, 30% vote Democrat, 20% vote Republican. And so in general, how can I think about identifying where the election outcome is on this simplex? Well, in this case, if 50% abstain, well, it must be on that part of the simplex where the abstention rate is always constant at 50%. That's just this horizontal black line that's parallel to the base of this triangle. And so that point must also intersect with the line where the Republican vote share is 20%. The intersection of two lines gives you a point. That's your election outcome, right? Incidentally, it also intersects with where the Democrat vote share is fixed at 30%. So here's a picture of all of my elections in my sample. The vertical line here is the even split line. So anything to the left of this is a Democratic victory. Anything to the right of this is a Republican victory. The blue dots represent races in which the Democrats are incumbents. The red points reflect cases where Republicans are incumbents. So you can already see just from visual inspection, incumbency advantage is going to be considerable. There are a few exceptions where you have some red dots on the left-hand side, right, where incumbent Republicans lose. Okay, so here's some initial, here's the results from the Dirichlet estimates compared to sort of just estimating a standard multivariate log normal. Candidate advertising taken in logs, it's significant. as well as campaign contributions and incumbency effect. Third-party advertising is not significant at all. Similar picture for Republicans. Notice a much smaller coefficient for Republican candidate advertising. Third-party advertising not significant. For the abstention rate, you've got a small effect of third-party advertising, but it's practically negligible. The other thing I want to point out, which is sort of a headline result, if you look at the R-squares, I have the same vector of variables for both models. The R-squared for the Dirichlet model does considerably better, almost an improvement of about 50% in cases, right? A bunch of robustness checks. So here's the sort of a depiction if I do a cubic spline, allowing for non-linearity of the effect of advertising spending. Democrats, again, for blue, it's much higher than for Republicans, which is in red. Okay. Here's another way to see that the Dirichlet model is better in terms of model fit. The black contour density maps, I don't know how well you can see that, is for the Dirichlet model, which captures a lot more of the variation. And then finally, I said that demographic characteristics are good predictors of the overall variation in the data. One way to see this is if I fix the demographic characteristics at their median values, you get a shrinkage of the overall spread of election outcomes, right? I'm going to skip this part. Okay, so in the last 2 minutes or so that I have, let's ask the question of to what extent can we replicate this exercise for the 2018 general elections, right? This is not so straightforward. One reason is because in Pakistan we have multi-party elections. Across your 272 National Assembly constituencies, the number of candidates contesting the election is also varying. So to address that, I'll just look at the top 2 ranked candidates, so the winner and the runner-up, and everything else I include as those as the obtainers, right? There's also a problem in the sense that I don't really have good measures of candidate effort. I don't have data on how much candidates are spending on their elections. The ECP does require that candidates submit summary of financial statement, but those in some sense are sort of garbage because the ECP has a limit of you can only spend, I think, ₹1 million, which is practically nothing, right? Also, getting demographic data for the constituencies is not such an easy task. This is because census data is done at the administrative level, and the administrative division sort of boundaries don't perfectly match with the national constituency boundaries, right? So I looked at the 2017 census data where I had whatever data I had at the MOZA level, I used to sort of construct the profile of demographic characteristics for each National Assembly constituency. Right? So just to give you an illustration, I know for each National Assembly constituency, the breakdown of education level for males and females. I know how many have just completed, say, primary education versus matriculation versus a college degree. I know for each, for the number of households, the kind of housing they have, you know, whether it's fully sort of solid concrete or pakka housing versus say, semi-pakka or kacha housing. I also know the number of households that have access to, say, basic utilities like water, gas, and electricity. Okay. Here's a picture of the spread of election outcomes for the 2018 general elections. The blue dots are for Punjab. Red is for Sindh. KP is green, and Balochistan is yellow. You tend to see that, well, so the takeaway from this is Punjab's, you see a lot higher turnouts, which is sort of what you would expect. In KP, Balochistan, you have less sort of contested races. The turnout is a lot lower. The runner-up gets a much smaller fraction of the vote. Sindh is a bit more spread out compared to the others. Okay, what if you just did a standard OLS? Where the dependent variable is just the number of votes that a candidate received, right? Here, these are just dummy variables reflecting the characteristic of the candidate. So PTI challenger versus say incumbent candidate who's not from PTI versus an incumbent PTI candidate, right? And I control for both provincial fixed effects as well as I split the country into 12 regions, which I'll talk about afterwards. I control for that as well. You see sort of pretty consistent pattern of the estimates. For PTI challengers, they have the largest sort of effect in terms of number of votes, much more than challengers for any other party. That might reflect the overall popularity of the party in 2018. It might also reflect, say, tacit support from certain institutions in the country. I won't go more than that. Here's the effect, here's the coefficients for the demographic characteristics. You see that the education level of females tends to be somewhat relevant. You've got significant there. The somewhat puzzling thing was that the coefficient on those which are aged between 18 to 60 is negative, whereas the coefficient on those which are aged above 60 is positive. So if you interpret that, that sort of suggests, well, the higher the number of people who are aged between 18 and 60, votes go down. The more older people there are, votes go up, which is sort of counterintuitive to sort of the narrative of, PTI being popular among the youth, for example. So I think there's some sort of evidence, this is evidence, I think, of some bias that's happening. If you look at the Dirichlet estimates, you've got a similar result. Incumbency advantage is sort of the largest for PMLN and PPP, followed by PTI. But interestingly, now you see the coefficients sort of align with what your theory might or sort of prior theory might say, right? The coefficient on those which are aged between 18 and 60 disappears, but is positive, right, for some cases. But the ones over 60, that disappears. And you also continue to have this significant coefficient for females which have only completed up to primary education. So it seems to be the case that, who turns out to vote in the constituency depends sort of on the disparity of education between males and females. That's one way to sort of interpret the data or the results over here. For the abstention rate, you've got similar stuff. Also note that the R squares are much better for the Dirichlet as opposed to the multivariate normal. So again, Dirichlet does better in terms of explaining the overall variation of the data. I'm going to finish by just making a few comments on future work, which is ongoing. So how can we sort of try and capture some measure of candidate effort? I'm looking at two things. One is, extracting information from news archives about campaign activity of each of the parties, maybe say 6 months leading up to the election. For incumbents, you might think that they might use public development expenditure in their constituency as a way to win over votes, right? And investing in sort of infrastructure development in their constituency. So I'm working on sort of putting this data set together and merging it with the election outcome data. And of course, if I can, use PSLM and HISA data to get more demographic characteristics. Okay, so I'll stop here. I've gone way over. I'll stop here and let Cory criticize the paper. Thanks.
Thanks so much for letting me discuss an interesting paper. I learned a lot, especially as someone who is just doing, regress Y on a dummy variable for his project. Okay, just a very brief summary. The paper is studying the determinants of elections and election results, both in the US and Pakistan. I think, there's two broad motivations here. One is to understand, how demographics or election spending translate into result shares. And then the other is to understand how the Dirichlet model performs relative to alternatives and goodness of fit. In the interest of time, I'm going to just skip the sort of what the Dirichlet is, how it compares, and some of the construction on data. There's a couple of different results that come out of this. For the US case, we get some nice estimates of the cost per vote, both for Democrats. That seems to be a little lower. And we also see the Dirichlet model has a much better fit as proxied by the R squared. Republicans seem to have a higher cost per vote, but again, there's a consistent result that the Dirichlet regression has a better model fit than some plausible alternatives. For Pakistan, there's sort of a lot of outcomes that go in here that are tough to summarize, but we can see that things like age and gender play a plausible role in determining how lopsided a win is, or in terms of turnout. Okay, so just a couple of very brief suggestions. Maybe suggestion number 0 is just in terms of thinking about framing. Even if we're just interested in the model goodness of fit, at least I, as a maybe fairly non-technical person, could have used some guidance in terms of what we should be looking for, and in terms of comparisons to alternatives. Do we primarily care about R squared? Is that the best measure? If so, maybe we should be using a machine learning model. Maybe we should just be adding, more flexible functional forms. How would the Dirichlet compare, to those alternatives? Second, maybe I care mostly about the efficiency of my estimates on individual coefficients rather than the R squared itself. How does Dirichlet affect that? You might have seen that in some of the cases, Dirichlet coefficients are similar to the alternatives. I promise not to talk too much about correlation versus causation, but I think that's also something I could use some guidance on here. If we do talk about things like the cost per vote, largely I do think of that as a causal statement, not a correlational one. What are some of the uses for the correlational stylized facts that a practitioner might have? It's also worth emphasizing that the US and Pakistan contexts are fairly different here. I don't just mean because, there's, different countries or anything like that, though that's true too. One thing is that, we're not seeing sort of a party-based delineation in the Pakistan case. We're seeing the winner versus runner-up. So mechanically, the number one candidate always gets a majority of the vote, or, the non-abstaining vote. And finally, I think there could be a lot more leaning into the Pakistan data. I think at least 2 of the the papers here could have would have loved to have some of this detailed like links between Moza demographic and economic information and some of these political outcomes. So definitely don't undersell that as part of the contribution. Let me leave it there and open it up to questions.
Thanks. Not many of you left, so I don't know if there are any questions or not. Yeah, Shady.
Thank you, Osama. Thanks for the presentation. I think I have a question because it sounds like your contribution is to highlight the Dirichlet model and how it does better than the other model. So I'm wondering, or simple regressions. So I'm wondering that maybe if that's the part you want to focus on, does it make sense to look at some existing papers where they have used the mainstream models and run regressions, and then showing how their results are changing and what are the sort of policy implications of just relying on those methods versus yours, right? Because I think right now you are in a situation where you are coming up with new results, and then you're saying that Dirichlet does better than the other. And I think that's to Cory's point as well, that, okay, you're looking at R square to make that judgment, but there's a lot more that's going on to in order for us to say that this model is better than the other. So looking at some existing published work and then sort of linking it to how the policy implications would change might feel more appealing, at least to me as a practitioner, that okay, this is how it's going to impact how we interpret findings from different things. So maybe that, but yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. So just to respond, the R squared is not the only thing I look at. I also look at sort of the AIC and the BIC because I'm doing maximum likelihood in both cases. I look at, those scores, which are sort of standard measures of goodness of fit. In that respect, the difference is not as great. So they're sort of comparable. The Dirichlet is sort of comparable to a standard multivariate normal. What I would say is I think, so in terms of the related literature, there's a lot of work that looks at, there's a lot of sort of quasi-experimental work, which looks at estimating the effect of, say, canvassing in the US context. There's practically, I think, very, very little work which looks at Pakistan. Ali Chima with Sarah Khan, they have this paper in the APSR, but that's also based on an RCT, which just looks at how you can increase the turnout for women, for example, based on the 2018 election. In that respect, I think the results are, not dissimilar to what I get for the Pakistani case, right? Where, the education level for females seems to play a role over there, right? In terms of, let me also go back to Cory's point about correlation versus causation. So in the paper, I don't emphasize this, but in my analysis, in my choice of, which covariates I'm using, I would argue I take sort of a control function approach, right? So you might think clearly advertising spending is endogenous. Why is it endogenous? Well, it sort of depends on how much money you have to play with. Okay, so I'll put in campaign contributions to try and control for that. Campaign contributions might be endogenous because if you're incumbent, you might have access to more resources, right? Okay, so I'll put an incumbency factor there as well. But incumbency might be endogenous because it might depend on sort of the underlying voter preferences. And so the key part is, if you put in demographic characteristics, that can be a good control for sort of underlying voter preferences. And the comparison was to see whether we could sort of repeat the exercise for the Pakistani case. I don't think there's a lot of work of this kind using observational data for Pakistan. So that's sort of still ongoing. But I take your comments. Thanks. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking around for this long. We appreciate it. Thanks very much. Enjoy. Thank you. Goodbye.